and industry affairs for New Skin, a longtime corporate citizen in the Provo area. They've been around, I believe, since the 80s. I lived here when they got started, and remember, it's been a long time. And I will not read his bio because you have had access to that for days now. But I will say that he has graciously agreed to come. He is a BYU alum from our law school, and I hope you'll pay careful attention to what he has to say today. And please join me in welcoming him.
Well, I am very happy to be here today. I was just remarking to my wife, I remember, it doesn't seem all that long ago, that I was sitting on the other side of the podium listening to lectures like this one. I was a poli-sci major at BYU, international relations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But I remember sitting out there and thinking that the people that are standing up here must really know something. And now that I'm here, I'm not sure that's the case. I've had a long career. Hopefully I've learned a few things along the way, but I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along too. So I was asked to give a little bit of an overview of the industry that I work in, for starters. How many of you are familiar with the direct selling industry? A few, I see. A few hands out there. Direct selling is a method of selling products, and this is the way New Skin sells its products. They sell through an independent sales network of people that are affiliated with the company but not employed by them. And so we have, well, let me start a little bit with the background of the company. New Skin Enterprises was founded in 1984. There were 4 main founders of the company. All 4 of them were BYU students. At the time, they had this idea to start up a company, and they kicked it around a little bit and eventually got a company up and running, but not before they had graduated from BYU. And one of the founders had gone on to law school at the BYU Law School. So the founders were Blake Roney, his sister Nedra Roney, Steve Lund, who was the original attorney at New Skin, and then another person named Sandy Tillotson. Again, they were all BYU students. Sandy was an elementary education major. Blake was a finance major. Steve went to law school. They all met at BYU. Steve Lund ended up graduating and going on to work in a law firm, and Blake started delivering subpoenas. He was serving process for Steve Lund's law firm, and they kind of got to know each other that way even better and talked about starting up a company. They started the company in 1984, and they started it with about $5,000 in startup capital. I don't know if any of you have seen the Provo campus of New Skin down here. Have you seen our building down at the intersection of Center Street and University Avenue? You'll see from looking at our building that we've grown a bit beyond the early days when they started with $5,000. Our current sales at our company vary year to year between about $2.5 and $3 billion. So we've grown a lot over the years. We've grown a lot since I went to work at New Skin. The company sells a premium line of personal care, skincare, nutritional supplement products. We focus very heavily on R&D. We employ 75 scientists who are heavily involved in anti-aging and the effects of aging on the cellular structure of the body. And we use a lot of that research to create cutting-edge products in the anti-aging space. Of course, we don't make medical claims about the products. That's one of the things I've taught them over the years. You can't make really aggressive claims. But anyway, we're also publicly traded. we were not when I went to the company. I went to the company in 1989, and at the time I went to the company, I think the annual sales were about $20 million. Now, again, they're between $2.5 and $3 billion, and you know, we've grown up as a company. We've had some interesting experiences along the way. I've been there for a lot of that. So let me talk a little bit about my education background. I mentioned I was a poli-sci major. I didn't start out that way. I came to BYU in the 1970s, and I started out, believe it or not, as a chemical engineering major. I didn't really know a lot about that at the time. I thought it sounded cool, and so I thought, well, maybe that's something I could do. And my high school guidance counselor told me that they made a lot of money. So I came to BYU and declared that I was a chemical engineering major. And then I came to the shocking realization that you actually have to do a lot of chemistry if you want to be a chemical engineer. And that was something that I was ill-prepared to do. I had a year of chemistry in high school, which was mostly playing around in a laboratory and trying to make odd substances in test tubes. And so I decided that that probably was not the best for me. I was a bit of a lackluster student in my first year at BYU. Let me give you a quote about education. Sam Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, astutely observed that education is that which reveals to the wise and conceals from the stupid the vast limits of their knowledge. Well, that's an interesting quote, I think. It's great curiosity to me through my educational experience and then through my career that the more I learn as I go along, the more I realize, you know, there are so many things that I know so very little about. So it's something of a humbling experience as you get a little bit older. I was more comfortable in my high school and college days when I thought I knew everything. And, you know, that's just a natural part of being young. There's nothing wrong with that. It gives you the confidence to go out and do a lot of the things that ultimately you'd like to do. So I went off after a relatively lackluster year at BYU and decided I would go on an LDS mission, and I ended up going to Taiwan to do that. At the time, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, I think I had a C average GPA in my freshman year at BYU. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are a number of very well-known graduates who have started out with relatively mediocre grades. At an SMU graduation in 2015, President George W. Bush said, "To those of you who received honors, awards, and distinctions, I say, well done. And to the C students, I say, you too may one day be President of the United States." So George Bush went to Yale. That's a tough school, but he was not a great student, and of course he went on to do great things. Life has a funny way of moving you in the directions that you need to go. And as long as you're an astute observer and you learn things along the way, it really doesn't matter how you get started. If you're willing to work and do things, I think you can achieve great things. So when I went to Taiwan, I had to learn Mandarin Chinese, and that was a great challenge for me at the time. It's a great program. You get thrown out into the market with a very cursory knowledge of the language, maybe spending a couple of months studying it. I studied here at the MTC in Provo, got out in China, realized that I had no idea what anyone was saying, and you either sink or swim when you're out there. You either learn to speak Chinese very quickly or you don't, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of difficulty to come by that knowledge. And I'm sure many of you have learned foreign languages and probably have been on LDS missions and done other hard things, but you'll know what I mean when I say that you either get out there and learn it quickly or you barely survive. So I'd been out there about a year, and I went into the mission office, and I'd been there about a month, and I got a call from the mission president who asked me if I would be willing to serve as a special legal assistant to Britt McConkie. Britt McConkie was the brother of the LDS apostle Bruce McConkie, and at the time he was living in the Philippines, and he was the LDS Church's lawyer for all of Southeast Asia. And I had no idea what that assignment entailed. I didn't know anything about the law. I knew very little about business in general or government. But I agreed to do that, and that ended up being a really great experience for me. How many of you have read J.R.R. Tolkien? A lot of you have read that. One of my favorite characters that he talks about in the first book, in the Fellowship of the Ring, is an innkeeper in the town of Bree. His name is Barlaam Butterbur. And the wizard Gandalf describes him as somebody who is slow and forgetful, but he can feel his way through a brick wall. Well, that's a little bit what it felt like to me when I was asked to start doing these legal projects. I had no idea what I was doing. Britt McConkie would show up every couple of weeks. He would hand me a very long punch list of things that he wanted me to work on there in Taiwan. And I just had to figure out how to do it, by and large, on my own. So I felt like I was feeling my way through a brick wall. I was involved in everything from trying to help people get visas that were trying to come to Taiwan. I eventually went on to help acquire property to build an LDS temple, to open another mission there. One of the more interesting things that I was involved in that capacity was I had the opportunity to help arrange a meeting between Ezra Taft Benson, who at the time was coming to visit Taiwan, and the president of Taiwan, a man named Jiang Jingguo, who was the son of the legendary Kuomintang Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. Many of you have heard of him. He had passed away just shortly before I got to Taiwan. He passed away in 1975, but his son had taken over as the president. And so that family has a very interesting history and a lot of interesting things. And of course, the son was heavily involved in all of that. His father had been the president or the leader of the Republic of China for just about 20 years in China before they were driven out by the Communist Revolution. And then he went on to be the president of Taiwan until his death when he was 85 years old. And so he spent nearly 30 years being the president of Taiwan. So I got involved in those kinds of things. It was a new experience for me. I hadn't had any opportunity to do that kind of thing in the past. But it was a great experience, and it sparked in me a real interest in things political, in being involved in the government and the political process to help solve problems that needed to be solved, whether it's for a business or a church or individuals. I found that very interesting. So eventually I came back from that experience, and I came back to BYU, and I enrolled in the core business classes. I thought at the time that I wanted to get an MBA at BYU, and that just seemed like a logical place for me to do. I was very involved in international business. I thought that was something I'd like to be involved in, and I thought getting an MBA would be a good way to get to that point. I was dating a very nice young lady at the time whose father was a professor in the MBA program. And after about a year of that, he suggested to me that they were really a lot more interested in people who had a more diverse background, people who hadn't necessarily come up through the business program. And so he recommended to me that I get out of the business program and try to get some diversity in my background. And at that point in time, that's when I went into the poli-sci program here at BYU. I was very interested in that. I'd had that exposure to that in Taiwan, and I decided to go ahead and get involved in that. And so thenceforth, I was a poli-sci student. I went ahead and took all of the business core classes because business was important to me. I thought one day I'd like to be involved in an international business. Didn't really know how I was going to get to that point, but that was a goal of mine. Somewhere along the line, I decided I was less enchanted with the MBA program, and I decided to go to law school. So I worked hard. My grades improved fairly dramatically after I came back from Taiwan. That was an important experience for me because being placed in that kind of a difficult situation, having to try to learn to do something that I really knew very little about, it taught me, very importantly, that if I was willing to work hard, if I was willing to really dig in, I thought I was probably capable of a lot more than I had originally believed I was when I was a C student freshman at BYU. Excuse me, at BYU. So I got in, I worked hard, I went to law school, I graduated from law school, and ended up going into private practice. And well, let me say a couple things about law school. I did not love law school. I loved my undergrad experience. I loved the poli-sci program. I found it very interesting. International relations was great. It gave me a lot of flexibility. I continued to study Chinese. I took all the business core classes. I took humanities classes. It just gave me a lot of flexibility to learn about a lot of things that I was interested in, but not necessarily related to the major. I didn't love law school. I don't think I even liked law school. I basically hated law school almost from the time that I started there until the time I finished. What I did like about law school was, first of all, the friends that I met there. It's a fairly traumatic experience going through law school, especially first-year law. I think the friends that you make in those kinds of trying circumstances end up being some of your best friends, and my friends from that period have remained my friends for the rest of my life. We still get together, we talk frequently, we do things together. That is one of the things I really appreciated about law school. The other thing I appreciated about it was it gave me a different way of looking at the world. I became very factually oriented. I felt like I needed to explore and test and really try my best to understand some of the things that were out there. I didn't necessarily anymore just accept things at face value. And I think going through that 3-year experience really did change the way my mind approached problems. I became a lot more analytical. My wife is here today. She will tell you I'm probably a little too analytical at times. She helps me see the other side of life, not just the facts at all times, and I appreciate her for that. Let me talk a little bit about my experience at New Skin. I met the guys at New Skin when I believe it was 1986. So I'd been out of law school for about a year. And my little brother was in high school at the time, and one of his best friends was a little brother to Blake Roney. And so he kept telling me about this interesting little company that he was working with. And I got a chance to meet the founders of New Skin at that time. And I found them to be very interesting people. The company was still small enough at that time. I didn't really see that as a viable option to go and work there. But I was approached by them a couple of years later. I think it was 1988. They came to me, and they were aware that I spoke Mandarin Chinese, that I had some international business experience, and they really encouraged me to come and interview to see about going in-house, to be in-house counsel for New Skin. And I remember at the time I went there, I was interested in them because of their name. They were billing themselves as New Skin International. And I remember my first interview, I asked Steve Lund, who was general counsel at the time, you know, what does that mean? Where are you doing business? And he said, well, right now we're only doing business in the United States, but we're interested in Canada. And you know, we see that as a stepping stone. We think that maybe we'll branch out internationally from there, and we think that maybe you could really help us figure out how to do that. And I found that to be a very interesting challenge. At the time, and I decided to take the job with New Skin. It was a little bit of a leap of faith. They were an interesting company. I wasn't sure that they would survive at the time. I'd heard good and bad about the company, a lot of interesting things going on there. But I liked the people. The people that I met with struck me as people of integrity. And so I decided to give it a go. Went to work for New Skin in early 1989. And looking back today, I've been there 30 plus years. It's fairly remarkable that I've spent that much time in one place and with one company. At the time I was in law school, I really thought if I ever wanted to get into international business and do the things that I want to do, I'm going to have to leave the state. I thought I'd have to go to the West Coast or the East Coast, and I did go out and interview with some law firms on the coasts, and eventually ended up working for one, doing a little bit of international legal work, and then I ended up coming back to Utah, and that's when I started to work for New Skin. So I was hired as a lawyer for the company, but one of the really valuable things that I was allowed to do when I went to work for the company was I was given the opportunity to get involved in all different kinds of things for the company. We were small enough at the time that when it came down to the end of the month and we had a lot of people calling in orders, they wanted to make their monthly quotas, I would go down and sit on the order lines and I would talk to these people that were ordering the products. I would go to the warehouse. I went to the warehouse and worked in order fulfillment and getting the orders ready to ship out. I went all over the company and kind of explored what was going on. I tried to learn how the distributors thought. I spent several months as a distributor representative, so I would be on the phone trying to solve problems for these independent salespeople. They put me with a group that was overseeing the Midwest, United States, and all of the Chinese-speaking distributors for the company. And at the time, I was sharing an office with Sandy Tillotson, one of the founders, and I think I used to drive her absolutely crazy speaking Chinese all the time on these calls that I would have with our Chinese-speaking distributors. But that was a really great experience. I really learned a lot about the company. I learned about all the different areas. I learned how the company worked, how the distributors thought. And that's one of the things that I would really encourage you to do as you go out, whether it's in a company or a political organization or if you end up working for the government. I would really encourage you to do everything that you can to try to understand the whole process of the company. Don't just channel yourself into political issues or whatever it is you end up doing. Don't be satisfied to just learn that part of the company. I think it's really critical that you learn as much as you can about what the company does, your key people, the people that are selling products or whatever they're doing. That's where the rubber hits the road. You've got to understand those people, I think, to be really successful in a career. Let me talk a little bit about some things that happened at New Skin in my very early years there. There were a number of investigations of the company, and those kind of grew out of the fact that we were growing so rapidly. At the time, I remember many months we would have 40 or 50,000 new independent salespeople sign up with the company, and then they were just out there trying to sell this as an opportunity, and they were making at times some pretty outlandish claims about the products that were not legal, medical claims. We did everything in our power to try to prevent that happening, but we were growing so quickly that, you know, there were times when we just couldn't deal with all the issues. We were hiring so many people all of the time, and we were growing so quickly that there were times when people were out there, we didn't know about it, and they were making claims that got the company in trouble. I'm going to ask you to show that little clip. This is, I ended up at that time dealing a lot with the media, and well, I dealt a lot with government regulators. I dealt with the attorney generals in a number of states, but one of the really interesting things that I got involved with at that time was dealing with the media. And this little clip, I remember seeing this at the time,
Good morning,
and it.
Dr. Hartvigsen. Thank you for coming. I hope it's not
Yeah,
too early.
just go ahead.
No, I had to get up to be on television.
Well, I'm glad you relaxed. I'm a little nervous myself. I mean, I've never interviewed a psychologist.
Well, don't worry about it. We're ordinary men, you know, one-legged.
This clip, by the way, is from Bob Newhart. How many of
Well,
you
if I
have watched or
start to
heard anything
ramble
about
a
Bob
little, or
Newhart?
if I get into an area I'm not conversant in.
Some of you,
you'll
there in
help
the
me out,
back.
won't you?
This is an
Don't worry about
oldie
it. If
but
you
a
get in trouble,
goodie.
just turn it over to me and I'll wing it.
And you'll hear when he describes how much money psychologists make, you'll hear how dated this is. But the message about how the media treats you is rather timeless.
It went to full screen and it changed the settings on us, didn't it? There it is, I see it.
I'm kind of a low-tech guy, by the way. That's why I'm not doing a PowerPoint. I'm stretching myself to have this little clip as part of my presentation. Yeah, we'll just leave it. It's kind of small, but yeah, let's just start it over.
Good morning, Dr. Hartvigsen. Thank you for coming. I hope it's not too early for you.
No, I had to get up to be on television.
Well, I'm glad you relaxed. I'm a little nervous myself. I mean, I've never interviewed a psychologist.
Well, don't worry about it. We're ordinary men, you know, one leg at a time.
Well, if I start to ramble a little, or if I get into an area I'm not conversant in, you'll help me out, won't you?
Don't worry about it. If you get in trouble, just turn it over to me and I'll wing it.
10 seconds, Ruth.
Thanks, Augie.
You'll be fine.
Here goes.
3, 2, you're on.
Good morning. It's 7 o'clock, and I'm Ruth Corley. My first guest is psychologist Dr. Robert Hartley. It's been said that today's psychologist is nothing more than a con man, a snake oil salesman, flim-flamming innocent people, peddling cures for everything from nail biting to a lousy love life. And I agree. We'll ask Dr. Hartley to defend himself after this message.
Was that on the air?
Oh, that's just what we call a grabber. You know, it keeps the audiences from tuning out.
10 seconds, Ruth.
Thanks, Augie.
We won't be doing any more grabbing, will we?
No. From now on, we'll just talk.
3, 2, you're on.
Dr. Hartley, according to a recently published survey, the average fee for a private session with a psychologist is $40.
That's about right.
Right? I don't think it's right. What other practitioner gets $40 an hour?
My plumber.
Plumbers guarantee their work, do you?
See, I don't understand why all of a sudden you...
I asked you if you guarantee your work.
Well, I can't guarantee that each and every person who walks through the door is going to be cured, you know?
You mean you ask $40 an hour and you guarantee nothing?
I validate.
Is that your answer?
Could I have a word with you?
All right, that, again, that's a bit dated, but gives you some idea of what it's like to deal with the media. I know back in the day when we were negotiating with a number of state attorneys general, I was negotiating with the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities Exchange Commission, and in addition to that, I got to be on a lot of media programs. We were on the Nightline program at one point in time. I got interviewed by the Washington Post, the New York Times. I was interviewed on CNN. And those are the kinds of questions that they throw at you. One of the important things to learn is how to deal with media situations, because if you're in politics or law, you're going to be dealing with things like that from time to time. Things are not always smooth for companies. They get in trouble from time to time. That was a difficult period with our company, but we were able to get through that. And I think it was because of what I initially sensed. I think it was because of the integrity of the people who were in charge of the company. I think it was also because we were willing to go to the regulators and deal with the problems head on. We didn't come in acting like we wanted to fight with them. We ended up going to them and saying, look, we understand these are problems. We want to fix these problems. Why don't you work with us, help us understand how to deal with these issues. And that's an important thing to remember as you're dealing with government officials or regulators. You need to go in being willing to cooperate. 99% of the time, I would say that a cooperative approach is much more effective than going in and wanting to fight and, you know, making a loud argument about why you're right and why they are wrong. Another thing that I learned during that period of time was how important it was to really engage proactively with a number of associations. I became a very active participant in groups like the Conference of Western Attorneys General, the National Association of Attorneys General, the Democratic AGs Association, the Republican AGs Association. Those are opportunities to go and get to know these people in a non-combative situation so that when problems arise, you're able to deal with them. And you know, we were able to shift the paradigm from being very hostile at times, having a hostile relationship with those folks, to now, you know, I'll often get a call from one of the attorneys general if they have an issue with one of our people in their state. You know, they just give me a call and we'll solve the problem, and that's about as far as it goes. So we learned some important lessons. I learned some important lessons about how to deal with that. Another really important thing that you will do is be involved in industry associations. There are a lot of industry associations that if you're working for companies, they're part of an industry, and they typically will have an industry association. There are a lot of valuable relationships to be had by participating in those, and not just going to the meetings, but volunteering to serve in different capacities. And I've tried to be very involved in the Direct Selling Association, in the World Federation of Direct Selling Associations, and some of my most rewarding experiences have been going out and meeting the people, being involved with those groups, going out and meeting with government agencies, talking about the issues that are important to your company. So those are all really important things to do. Now, international travel is a big part of what I have done. As I mentioned, when I went to the company, we were only doing business in the United States. We're currently doing business in over 50 markets around the world. And I've had the opportunity and the curse, I suppose, of being actively involved in going out to those markets, trying to understand the regulatory framework. I have logged a lot of miles. I currently have about 3.5 million miles in my Delta Sky Miles account. I have nearly $1 million in a United similar program. So I've spent a lot of time on the road. I've burned a lot of shoe leather. And one of the things I would tell you about that is take the time to appreciate the places that you have the opportunity to go. Many of you, if you get involved in political science careers, you'll be out traveling, you'll be meeting with people. Don't just go out and go to the meetings. I've always tried to take a little extra time when I'm out. I used to get up early in the mornings. Well, I still do when I can make myself, but I have been a runner, and I've run in many of the great cities of the world, and that gives you an opportunity to get out on the ground early in the morning when the cities are just coming to life, and those are the kinds of things that are really nice to do. And also, you know, maybe try to take a little time at the end of your time in a country or even in another city in the United States and appreciate what they have to offer. You'll get to the end of your career one way or the other, and it will come surprisingly quickly. And I think you'll regret it if you haven't taken the time to try to appreciate some of those things. Let me talk just for a couple minutes about China. I want to give you a specific example of some of the things that I've been involved in and some of the things that you might be involved in when you go out to work for a company. China was closed to direct selling in about the mid-1990s. They did not allow direct selling companies to do business in China. And so one of the things that we started doing is we got very actively involved as an industry and as a company, lobbying in behalf of China up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I spent a lot of time up there lobbying congressmen about the need to involve China, to allow them to continue to be a valued trading partner with the United States. We were lobbying for the United States to ultimately grant China permanent normalized trading relationship status. Before that time, every year they had to go through this painful process to be allowed to trade with the United States on a more or less equal footing. And so we actively encouraged the U.S. Congress to grant them that status. They eventually did. That was the step that allowed China to accede to the World Trade Organization. And because of our industry's very active support in that space, we worked with, at the time, Barbara Franklin, who was the Secretary of Commerce. Charlene Barshevsky was the U.S. Trade Representative, and she was the top trade negotiator for the United States. They were able to build into China's WTO accession agreement a specific provision that would allow direct selling to return to China. It was in China earlier, and then they banned it in China. And so when they acceded to the World Trade Organization, we were able to actually have them agree to draft regulations that would allow direct selling to re-enter the China market. That has been a very valuable thing for our company. I mentioned that we do about $3 billion a year in global sales. A third of that is in China now. It rapidly went. In 2006, China drafted the direct selling regulations. That allowed us to establish a very vibrant market in China. And that's just a kind of a brief example of the kinds of things you might be involved in as you go out and get involved in an international career. I think I've probably spoken. Let me just say a couple of other things, and then I'll open it up to some questions if you're interested in talking to me a little bit more, asking questions about some things you might be interested in. Charles Kuralt said, thanks to the interstate highway system, it is now possible to travel from coast to coast without seeing anything. That goes to the point that I made earlier about taking the time when you're out there to get out and appreciate where you are. Again, I reiterate, that's one of the things that you'll get the opportunity to look back upon at the end of your career and be really happy that you took the time to do that. I mentioned becoming a professional networker, being involved in these associations, trade associations, being involved with government associations. Those are really important things to get to know the lay of the land if you're going to be a political scientist and deal in the world of political and international relations. One important thing to remember, I talked about the average people, the C students. I call that everyone is a chowderhead syndrome. There's a comedian named Larry Miller that does a whole bit on that. It's very funny, but the point of his humor is that even though you think all of these people are really remarkable, amazing people, and the smartest people you've ever met, they're basically chowderheads, just like we all are. Don't be afraid, don't be intimidated. I've had the opportunity in my career to spend time with some of the world's brightest and best. I've had an opportunity in my work with the company to meet and spend time with Henry Kissinger, several of the presidents. You know, there's a tendency to be a little intimidated when you're around people like that and feel like, who am I that they would be even interested in hearing what I have to say. But I encourage you, when those opportunities come along, don't be intimidated by those people. They are chowderheads just like we are. They're really smart chowderheads. They're very accomplished, but take the time to enjoy getting to know some of those people, and you will have an opportunity to meet those people in your career. One other thing I would encourage you to do, if you're going to be in political science, I think it's really helpful if you have the opportunity to work in government. If you're going to be working on the other side of that, the best way to understand the way government agencies think, the way that people deal with problems, is to go and spend a few years working for them. You'll find that as you go back to Washington, D.C. and the other capitals of the world, some of the very brightest and best people are working in relatively low-paid government jobs, and they will do that for a number of years, making sure they understand all of the ins and outs of the organizations, what they need to do to deal with problems, and then they'll jump back across the aisle and go into private business and use those skills. So that's something I would really encourage you to do. And I would also like to say just one thing about integrity. You'll be faced with many opportunities in your career, and sometimes it seems tempting to take shortcuts. Sometimes in business, you'll want to push the extremes of what's legal and not legal, or get into some gray areas. I encourage you not to do that. I think that it's important to hang on above all else to your integrity. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind." And I think you'll find that that is one of the things that you'll hang on to in your career and will be meaningful to you. And then the last thing I'd like to say is have fun. It's really a great opportunity. It's a wonderful thing that you're doing. You'll meet some of the most interesting people in the world. Have a good time while you're doing it. Thank you.
There's a little time for questions. We do ask you to come to the mic today because we are recording and we want to be able to hear the question.
Hi, how's it going?
Good.
I
How
have
are
a
you?
question. Good. How does the, so speaking of today's world with China, how does the current tariffs and political situation with China affect your work with government relations?
It makes my work very difficult.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time in China. I go there probably 2 to 4 times a year. When I mentioned the process that we went through in China to get direct selling legalized, we still have a lot of challenges in China. They do not allow us to do direct selling like we do elsewhere in the world. Once the trade war heated up, they suddenly became unwilling to discuss making the necessary modifications they need to make with regard to direct selling. And I think a lot of companies are facing that, whether they're hit with heavy tariffs or other restrictions. China has just quit being willing to talk about dealing with many of the issues that they have to deal with.
Awesome. Thanks.
You mentioned that you were in over 50 markets around the world. How is a market defined in your sphere rather than saying, 50 countries?
Well, 50 countries is probably a more accurate way to put that. We are doing business in over 50 countries. So I'm just calling them markets because that's where we're, marketing a particular product. But we're doing business all over Asia. We do about probably 45 to 50% of our business in Asia, and the rest of that of our world market is split between Europe and the United States. So we treat them regionally. We have regional offices, and we deal with people through the region, but we also have independent offices in each one of the countries. So we have a lot of people all over the world in these countries or markets that are working with us.
So you said that you didn't really like law school, any of the 3 years. So I'm kind of curious. While you were in law school, how did you know that this would be something that you would want to do if you weren't really enjoying the process of learning about it?
That's a good question. There were many days when I questioned my decision to go to law school. I thought, I can't believe I've chosen to do this voluntarily. And there were times when it was tempting to give it up. But I felt like if I could get to the end of that process, and I talked to enough people who were out practicing law and involved in business in a legal capacity, I felt like if I could get beyond that 3-year testing period, then it would probably be worth it. So that's what kept me with it. And when I say I didn't like it, there are a lot of things I did like about law school. There were professors that I particularly enjoyed. There were subjects that were very interesting to me, but as a whole, the experience was very challenging for me.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Braden?
Probably the last question, and then if we have others, we can come talk individually.
You expressed the importance of integrity, and I'm just curious if you have a story that comes to mind where you were challenged with, compromising your integrity and how you overcame that temptation.
Okay, that's a good question. That comes up frequently, particularly in the international markets. Part of the process of getting approvals to be able to do business in countries is dealing with government officials. And there have been a number of times in my career when I've been approached by government officials asking me for what I would frankly consider a bribe. And they will say things like, either give us X amount of money. If you do, we'll get you the approvals, we'll get you into the country. If you don't, we will make your life very difficult. That has happened to me in Malaysia, that's happened in other markets, and there were times, for example, in Malaysia when I just had to say, no, we won't do that. It's inappropriate for us to do that, and that delayed our entry into that market by a couple of years. But I made the decision, and I think the company certainly would back me up on that's something you just don't do.
Thank you.
Sure.
Join me in thanking Rich.